No? Yes? No. Cameron says no. Thank you for your honesty, Cameron. I'm glad there's somebody honest in here. Fairness, right? We teach our children. Obviously, we have a little bit of work to do. Or maybe we're doing it right. I don't know. I'll let you decide. But we learn about fairness whenever we're young. But more importantly, we learn how to respond to that when we're young. How many of you have witnessed full-on adult meltdowns, like in public places, where people just, yeah, right? A lot of us. How many of you had? No, I'm just kidding. Hopefully none of you have had full-on adult meltdowns, but I remember one time being at a McDonald's here in town, and somebody walked in, and it was somebody who I knew, and she was like cussing and screaming before she even walked in the door. I could hear this woman outside. She walked in, I looked at her, she made eye contact with me, so it's not like she didn't realize that I was there. And she's just screaming and yelling, and walks up to the desk or the counter, and it just was this really awkward thing. Like she made a complete scene in the middle of that McDonald's. And her issue was that they got her order wrong. They got her order wrong. It's amazing. She humiliated that poor girl behind the counter. Then she looked at me, and she's like, I'm sorry that you had to witness that. She's like, but they got my sandwich wrong. And I was like, I'm sorry I had to witness it too. I was like, I could not believe that she blew up over a sandwich. Blew up over a sandwich. But I've witnessed things like that in my life where people, adults or supposed adults, have behaved far worse than I've seen any child behave at their worst. We're taught about fairness, what's right, what's fair, but we're also taught about how to respond to that whenever we're young. And how you're taught and disciplined or not taught and not disciplined will determine how you behave as an adult, for the most part. And so we see a lot of people who feel like they're getting ripped off, and they just get really livid about it. We try to teach our kids that sometimes people make mistakes, and you start by assuming that somebody made a mistake. Unless you absolutely know that somebody was intentionally trying to sabotage you, whether you're at a restaurant or wherever, you start with the assumption that maybe somebody's just having a bad day or somebody messed up. I don't know about you, but I fall on the spectrum where I will go out of my way to not say anything, even if somebody really messed up and I got something that I loathe, and which doesn't happen often. But if I get something that I don't really like, or that I didn't order, or that I don't want, I will err on the side of not saying anything. Because to me, it's just not worth making a big deal over. Somebody messed up somewhere, and that's okay. Like, we teach our kids it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay for other people to make mistakes. Life will go on. So we teach them that, but there's this story that's really interesting, and I want to talk about that because Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like this. And it's a scenario that seems really unfair. And so I want to unpack that a little bit and talk about, what Jesus is really talking about in this parable. Because I feel like as we equip people, sometimes we experience this in the church, where people feel wronged by whether it's somebody else in the church or somebody out there, and they just explode, and they get so mad, and they cry wolf, and this isn't fair, and this isn't right, and right? We've heard this in the church. It's just not fair. It's not right. I wasn't treated right. I didn't get enough recognition or enough thanks or whatever it is. We think this way sometimes, maybe too often, in the church. I'm going to reread this story, but I've underlined a couple things that I really wanted to draw attention to. Jesus said, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard." I think the assumption here, they agreed to a denarius a day. The assumption is That's a per day wage, which was typical in the first century. A denarius was about an average day's wage. It's the equivalent of a little over $2 today. So not a lot of money, but back then that was a fair wage for a day's work. The assumption is that they're not just working one day, that they're hired to continue working because they agreed to the sum of 1 denarius per day. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And going out about the 3rd hour, which is 9 o'clock in the morning, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And he said to them, "You go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right, I will give you." It's interesting because he didn't come up with a specific amount. He just said, "Go to work, and at the end of the day, I will give you what's right." So they went, going out again about the 6th hour and the 9th hour, so 12 o'clock noon and 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Going out again the 6th hour and 9th hour, he did the same. And about the 11th hour, which is 5 p.m., about the 11th hour, he went out and found others standing, and he said to them, "Why do you stand here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "Go into the vineyard too." Now he doesn't even mention money. According to Matthew, there's no mention of money. He just says, "Go into the vineyard," knowing that there's 1 hour of work left. A work day was 6 to 6. Go out into the vineyard, and they did. And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last," starting with those who started at 5 o'clock. Now, picture this. They're all gathered together. They're all within earshot. They can see the money being dished out. Beginning with the last, the people who are hired at 5 p.m., up to the first. And when those hired about the 11th hour came, each one of them received a denarius. Now, when those hired first came, they thought they would receive more, which is interesting, right? They agreed to 1 denarius, but they saw the other person who was hired at 5 p.m. getting a denarius. They've been working 12 hours, and they thought, well, now we're going to get a bonus because he's starting with them. He's given a denarius. We agreed to a denarius. Surely we're going to get more for working 11 more hours. Now, when those hired first came, verse 10, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. And on receiving it, they grumbled at the master of the house, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you've made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take whatever belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last worker as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity? So the last will be first, and the first last." How many of you read this story and get a little bit agitated, maybe? Or maybe you just think, the kingdom, it's not really a good example to use of the kingdom because it's so unfair, right? Like, I've read this story before, and I've struggled with it. I still struggle a little bit because I'm like, these guys literally worked an hour, and the other guys worked 11 hours. And they got the same amount. Not only that, you paid the last people first in front of them on purpose. That's what the kingdom of heaven is like? I don't know, Jesus. So here are some of the questions that I have, or possible scenarios. And these are just ones that I came up with. Possible scenarios for this story. Number one, God is unfair. God doesn't pay wages accordingly, right? The people who work really hard should be rewarded for their work. Second scenario, life is unfair. Maybe it's not so much the master, but God is proving a point that life is just unfair. Scenario number three, maybe the workers are being unfair. Maybe they should have more understanding for the people who only worked an hour. Maybe heaven is unfair. Maybe the point of the story is heaven is unfair, so you may as well get used to it here on earth, because when you get there, your eyes are going to be opened, and it's not going to be fair. Or perhaps God is just and righteous, and there's more to the story than meets the eye. I think that's the last. No, I have one more. Look at that, a bonus one. Maybe the point of the story is that there is no reward gap in heaven. We talk about this income gap, right? And it exists. I mean, there is no denying that there is this radical chasm between the extremely wealthy and the extremely poor. In class this morning, we talked about the city of LA and how the homeless population is exploding. It's so big and homelessness is so rampant. And the homeless people are not permitted to live anywhere except for Skid Row. Skid Row is the most violent, dangerous, gang-infested, drug-infested section in all of California, and that's where the homeless people have been confined to. There's this radical gap. By the way, LA is a super rich county. There's absolutely zero reason whatsoever why homelessness should exist in LA. It should not exist. There's so much wealth in LA. It's unbelievable. But yet there's this big gap. And so maybe Jesus' point is there is no reward gap. So I want to back up and look at a little bit of what's going on in this story. First of all, there's a story that falls right before this where Jesus used that same term, that same phrase. Those who are last will be first, those who are first will be last, right? He uses that same term in chapter 19, and it's a story, ironically, about a rich young man. This guy who's rich, he has all this money, and he comes to Jesus and says, what do I need to do to be perfect? You remember that story? He says, why do you ask me about what is good? There's only one who is good. If you would enter life, keep the commandments. And he said to him, which ones? And Jesus said, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, honor your father and mother, and you shall love your neighbors yourself. The young man said to him, all these I have kept. What do I still lack? And Jesus said to him, if you would be perfect, go sell all that you possess, give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And then come follow me. When the young man heard this, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. And then we skip down to the end of that. There's a bunch more that Matthew writes, and we skip down to the end in verse 29. And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or lands for my name's sake will receive 100-fold and will inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last first. Jesus is saying that this guy amassed all this wealth, and he was righteous, he was good, he was following the commandments of God, but he lacked one thing. If he really wanted to be perfect, he would take care of who? The poor. Now, I don't think Jesus is saying, if you want to follow me, you need to sell everything right now. Sell your home, sell your cars, sell everything. Sell your clothes, pull them off your rack and in your closet, sell everything. I don't think Jesus is calling us to do that. I think the point of this story in Matthew 19 is that this rich man, he was rich, he was doing these commandments, he was righteous, but he wasn't taking care of the poor. The least of these. And the very next story is this story that we just read in Matthew chapter 20. So I want to look at a couple of the details because I think they're really important. First of all, the first group of people, and keep in mind, he's saying the kingdom of heaven is like this. It's like this. And then he tells this parable. First of all, the master is the one in control, right? He's the one who hires people. He's the one who determines the wages. Who's to argue that? God determines what happens to us when we die. Is there anybody here who's going to argue that? Do we want to stand up and start bargaining with God when He's sentencing us to eternal life? Do we want to argue? Tell Him He's unfair and that He's not making the right decision? Right? So the kingdom of heaven is like this. The master is the one who holds the freedom to tell people what their wages are. And after agreeing with the laborers for a denarius, that first group, he sent them into the vineyard. Then the second group, he determines that he'll give them whatever is right. These people came late in the game, and we know from the end of the story, he ends up giving them the same amount, 1 denarius. And then this last group is kind of interesting. He asked the question, why do you stand here idle all day? And they said to him, because no one has hired us. That's important. Well, why is that important? Because one, they didn't say, well, because we don't want to work. They didn't say, well, because we just didn't feel like it. For whatever reason, whether it's health, whether it's they just don't look like they're good laborers, whether they're incapacitated to some degree or disabled, we don't know the reason, but they were not hireable. And we can presume that this is not just a one-day deal. This is probably an ongoing thing, which means this master is hiring, late in the game, he's hiring homeless people, more than likely, homeless people or people who are handicapped to some capacity. Maybe they can't pick very fast. Maybe they went out there and picked 5 grapes that day. It's a good possibility. And so it's interesting because to me this is a story about compassion. It's about teaching other people that when things are seemingly not fair, that God has the freedom to increase grace and to treat people with equity. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last. This was intentional. This was for a reason. He didn't do this accidentally. He purposely paid those people first who had only worked an hour. And I think he did it to prove a point, to make people think, to show them that he's going to have compassion on whom he has compassion. If you think about heaven being like this, it means that the people who we get annoyed by, the people who we walk by, the people who we fail to hire, or the people who we fail to include in church. When we serve, when we're equipping people to serve, think about it. If we're honest with each other, be completely honest right now. You don't have to answer this out loud. Are there people with whom you would go out of your way to not choose to serve beside you? Oh, we have an out loud one. Yeah, right? There are people who at the end of the day, if we're being 100% honest, at the end of the day, there are people, even in this own body, who we have not asked to serve. For whatever reason, we have not invited them to serve side by side with us. And Jesus is making a point that God has compassion on those people, that those people are not throwaways, that those people are included not only in the work of the kingdom, but in the kingdom itself. They're included. They're saved. They're part of heaven. And of course, the reward that he's talking about is not a monetary reward of a denarius, but it's the reward of heaven itself. And that reward doesn't fluctuate. In other words, those who are in, and there is no income gap. When we get to heaven, there is no heaven gap. There are no people who are more privileged than other people. There are no people in heaven who are going to be, sitting with their feet propped up and being fanned by somebody while other people are working their tails off in heaven saying, at least I made it, right? Like, that's not what heaven is like. And so Jesus uses this radical story to show us not only an example of how we should behave here on earth, but to show us what heaven itself is like. And it's this place where people take care of each other, where the master has compassion on everybody, on all of his workers, and that the wages are the same. And that bothers us sometimes because some of us feel this in real life. We've done things in our life where we feel so unworthy that we say, I don't even feel worthy of God's forgiveness. I've done things that people don't know. I've done things that are really horrible. I've done things that are ugly. I've done things that are gross. I've done things to hurt other people. Some of those are intentional. Some of those are not. But I am not worthy of God's forgiveness. Jesus is coming back and saying that the kingdom of heaven is like this. That everybody who makes it into the kingdom, who's invited into the kingdom, is going to be treated with fairness and grace by the master. And this question, a rhetorical question, do you begrudge my generosity? Who are we to say who God treats with fairness and kindness and compassion? So I think as we equip people, as we equip others to serve for works of ministry, we better be sure to include everybody. There's nobody here who's a throwaway. There's nobody who we should exclude. There's nobody who we should say, well, they probably won't put that much effort in anyway, so we'll just, why even ask them, right? We shouldn't say those things. If they put in minimal effort, we should still include them. We should still invite them. We should still ask them. We should still equip them. Because that's what this story is about. So this last point, there is no reward gap in heaven. I want us to rethink and reimagine the way that we treat one another and the way that we treat people out there even. Treat people with fairness. Treat people with respect. Be generous with your time, with your money, and the way that we equip people. If there's anybody this morning who's not yet taken that step to put Christ on in baptism, or anybody who has any prayer needs, we would encourage you to come up, or one of our shepherds will be in the back as we all stand and sing a song together.